I am very pleased to introduce Shelley Boulianne from MacEwan University, who will be chairing. Thank you, Shelley, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. So I just want to run through the rules really quickly again. I know you guys have been participating all morning, but for some of us, like me, it's early morning and I just woke up and I'm doing this. So each paper will get 25 minutes to present. I will interrupt you at the 15-minute mark just to tell you to wrap things up. So if you have talked a long time, it is your time to talk, but I will interrupt you at 15 minutes so that you know that you should be wrapping things up at that point, allowing for question and answers. And the audience members can type in their questions on chat, and I'll be writing down these questions to keep track of them because the chat proceeds quite quickly. I will write them down and I will pose them after the presenter is finished. And just one more reminder that if you are not presenting, that you will keep your microphone on mute so we don't have any background noises. And so for the first presenters, I think all the presenters are online. I sifted through everybody that's here, but I don't know which of the team is going to be presenting. So if you're the presenter, you'll be taking it over right away. But our first paper is Populist and Pessimistic, the role of populist attitudes in election projections. So whoever's presenting that paper.
Yeah, this is me. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Shelley. I'm going to present a study I conducted with my colleagues, Tali, Sina, Christian, and Keren. I'll share the screen with you. All right. Okay. So can you see it?
Yes, everything looks great.
Great, thanks. So the study I'm going to present deals with populist attitudes and citizens' expectations about election outcomes. Specifically, this presentation will focus on the extent to which people with high levels of populist attitudes rely on the predictions of public opinion polls published in the media when forming their expectations about the outcomes of imminent elections. And before I will elaborate on the objectives of this study, I would like to begin by presenting a common and well-accepted definition to populism and to populist attitudes. In the literature, populism is seen as an ideology that in its essence revolves around and praises the ordinary people. In this sense, populist thinking is opposed to elitism. And populist ideology consists of three core elements. The first is that the people is seen as a homogeneous unit and its members are perceived to be virtuous and righteous. Second, just like any ideology that emphasizes in-group identity, populist ideology cultivates enemies, and the main enemy of the people is the elite, which is perceived to be corrupt and immoral. Thus, politics is seen as an ongoing struggle between the people and the elite. Thirdly, according to populist ideology, it is the people's will, not the elite, that should guide politics. Accordingly, people who hold such perceptions are considered to have higher levels of populist attitudes. Now, the literature on populism stresses populism affinity to an imagined past. It has been argued that populists often long to the glorious days of the community. At the same time, populism seeks to restore those glorious days and bring back the power to the people. If we look at the examples here, America should be great again, and the greatness of the authentic Jewish people should be restored. And in this sense, populism is also oriented towards the future. However, the scholarship paid little attention to this aspect. So our research project deals with the link between populist attitudes and perceptions of the future, and it does so by exploring the relationship between populist attitudes and election projections. Particularly, it focuses on three aspects. The first is a cognitive aspect. We explore how people with high levels of populist attitudes form expectations of upcoming election outcomes using information made available by public opinion polls. The second is an affective aspect, where we examine the relationship between populist attitudes and expected feelings towards election outcomes. Finally, on the behavioral level, we examine how the later feelings interact with populist attitudes to affect turnout. However, in this presentation, due to time constraints, I will focus only on the first aspect, that is, whether people with high levels of populist attitudes rely on the predictions of public opinion polls published by the media when forming their expectations about election outcomes. And this aspect is interesting because, first of all, the media play an important role in shaping citizens' expectations about elections by mediating the predictions of public opinion polls, experts, journalists, political actors, etc. And secondly, because the media are key targets of populists. The media are seen as part of the elite, and as such, according to populist thinking, they do not reflect and represent the will of the people, but rather serve the elite. Now, several studies demonstrated a relationship between populist attitudes and negative perceptions of the media. Particularly, Fauzi has shown that people with strong levels of anti-elitist populist attitudes are more inclined to distrust the media. Now, we know from studies in different fields of research that when people distrust a source and when they're in a distrustful mindset, they reject the information to which they had been exposed. Given their lack of confidence in the media, it is reasonable to assume that people with strong populist attitudes rely less strongly on opinion polls when forming their expectations about upcoming election outcomes. Therefore, we hypothesize that the election outcome predictions of people with high levels of populist attitudes deviate from those expressed in public opinion polls published by the media. Now, in our study, we use this Israeli September 2019 national elections as a case. This occasion was the second time Israeli citizens went to the polling stations in 6 months, as none of the two largest parties succeeded to form a coalition government in the aftermath of the first elections. In both election campaigns, it was a close race between two parties, the Likud, the ruling party headed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Blue and White, a new party headed by Benjamin Gantz. Now, the setting of a close race makes the examination of citizens' election expectations attainable because compared with a situation where there is a sole clear winner, close races allow higher variation in citizens' expectations. Now, the analysis draws on two databases. The first is a panel survey conducted among Israeli citizens in 2 waves before the elections. We use this data to determine citizens' election outcome expectations, their media diet, as well as their populist attitudes. And the second is a content analysis we conducted to gauge the predictions of public opinion polls that were published by the media. Let's begin with the survey and with our dependent variable. In the beginning of the survey, respondents had to indicate which party they believe is going to receive the highest number of votes. And we can see that in both waves, the rate of people who expected the Likud would be the largest party was higher than the rate of people who expected Blue and White to be the largest party, about 60% compared with a little bit over 30%. About 7% of the respondents made no prediction or named other minor parties and were excluded from the analysis. With regard to the measurement of populist attitudes, respondents had to indicate their level of agreement on a 4-point scale, where higher values mean more agreement with items that tap into the 3 components of populism: people's homogeneity, anti-elitism, and people's sovereignty. The mean score of this index variable was 2.77 in the first wave and 2.74 in the second wave. To capture respondents' media diet, respondents were presented with a list of media outlets, both mainstream and peripheral, and in the list of senior politicians and journalists, and they had to indicate which media outlets they consumed during the last week and which politicians and journalists' social media account they follow. In the next step, we collected all the reports on public opinion polls that were published in their respective outlets and profiles during this period. As part of the content analysis procedure, we coded the items in an attempt to determine which party is the largest according to the poll, the Likud, blue and white, or a party tie. Once we had that information, we could calculate a personalized prediction score that denotes the mean predictions of the polls for each respondent. The continuous scale for this variable ranges from -1, meaning that all the polls to which a respondent was exposed predicted the Likud would be the largest party, to 1 that denotes that all the polls a respondent was exposed to predicted that blue and white would be the largest. In order to test the hypothesis, we conducted 2 moderation analyses, 1 for each wave, with respondents' expectations of the largest party as our dependent variable, the personalized score of polls predictions as independent variable, and populist attitudes as a moderator. We control for the respondents' gender, age, level of education, political ideology, and political interest. What we see in the figures here is the conditional effect of populist attitudes on the relationship between polls predictions and respondents' expectations. We have 3 levels of populist attitudes: low, which is represented in the blue line, red level medium level in red, and high level in green, which is what we mostly care about. And we can see that people with high levels of populist attitudes expect the opposite of what the polls to which they've been exposed to say. For instance, and I'm intentionally giving a simplistic example, if the polls say the Likud would be the largest party, they expect blue and white to be the largest party, and vice versa. And we can see how different this situation from the situation among people with low levels of populist attitudes will seem to predict in accordance with the polls. Importantly, this effect was only significant in the first wave. So the findings show that the expectations of people with high levels of populist attitudes are at odds with the predictions of public opinion polls appeared in the media. The media predict one thing and populists expect the opposite. And I believe this is an indication for the adverse and distrustful perception people with high levels of populist attitudes have towards the media. And ironically, and although they wouldn't like it, the findings suggest that a strong media effect on people with high levels of populist attitudes as the media tell them what not to think. Now, of course, our study has some limitations. We should bear in mind that we can't really tell for sure that respondents were exposed to the polls we assume they had been exposed to. After all, they reported the media outlets they consumed. We don't know the specific content they consumed. At the same time, we should also remember that the media present their forecasts about election outcomes in various ways, and the results of opinion polls are only one of them. So it is possible that populist people are not convinced by opinion polls, while at the same time they are convinced by the predictions made by other agents that appeared in the media. So an interesting direction for future studies would be to study which agents do inform people with populist attitudes about election outcomes in particular and about impending events in general. In conclusion, I believe that the study presented here sets the foundation for the examination of the complex relationship between the media, populism, and perceptions of the future. As such, it invites further investigation for the ways by which people with high levels of populist attitudes perceive of the future and the role the media have in this process. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. I didn't see any questions come through on the chat, but I do have questions myself. Which of these parties, if any, would be aligned with the populist ideology?
Sorry, can you repeat it, please?
So you mentioned there's two parties. There was a competition between two parties. Are either of these parties a populist party, or?
It depends how you define populist parties. If you look at the ideology of those parties about their manifestos, so yeah, you can say that the Likud, the ruling party, is more populist than blue and white. Okay. If you look at the attitudes of the voters for these parties, so apparently it's the opposite. The voters of blue and white were more populist compared to the voters of the Likud party.
All right, so we do have some questions that came through on the chat. Does the source of the opinion poll affect the perception of people who hold populist attitudes?
I'm not sure about it. What do you mean? I mean, the person who asked this question, what do you mean by affect the prediction there?
So if I'm going to guess, you did a content analysis of the opinion polls to find out who was set forth as the front runner on these electoral races. Was that specific information fed to the respondents, or were you just using these as two independent sources? So like, could you say this newspaper said this is the front runner and then ask for people's opinion on it? Could you make that sort of association?
Okay. First of all, what we did was we didn't ask our respondents to read a paper. It wasn't an experiment. So we can't really tell for sure what were the outlets that their respondents were exposed to. But what I can say that all of the reports on public opinion polls were actually initiated by mainstream media. So even if a respondent was exposed to an outlet, a non-mainstream outlet, the item was appeared as a follow-up to stories in the mainstream media. So we didn't examine any difference between outlets or any sort of this.
Okay, so the next question follows up on that question. Do you have a sense of what the alternative sources of information were communicating? Specifically, the chatter has said, do you think that these voters were exposed to pessimistic expectations by alternative sources of information?
All we have, I mean, in this study, all we have is the reports on public opinion polls, and the public opinion polls are, I mean, the reports on public opinion polls are very objective reports. So it's not like they're trying to be like to present an optimistic or pessimistic point of view. They just report on the polls. So I'm not sure that in these kind of reports, there is an effect for the tone of the report, because there is no tone, I mean.
All right, I have another question. How is populist attitude perceived by the respondents themselves? Does their attitude towards being a populist color their decision on how they want to be projected via their responses?
We didn't examine these issues, so I don't know. But what I can say is that, and I believe it's a universal tendency, that people don't see themselves as populists. People can, believe others are populists, but they don't see themselves as populists and don't like to think about themselves as populists. So.
And so there's another comment, not a question, but a comment. In Latin America, a region with long lineage of populist, people usually don't trust the polls. Populists are defined mainly as those who challenge traditional parties or the corrupt elite. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I guess this is in line with our results, that people with high levels of populist attitudes do not trust the polls, and they think that they are biased. And
right, I have an easy question for you. I'm wondering about the panels. So I'm interested in panel data, but your sample size goes up at wave 2. Is that because you have a top-up sample, or it's not the same people, right? So how much of it is the same people at 2 points in time?
Yes, this is the higher number in the second wave is because this panel survey is actually part of a larger project that began with previous waves. So in the first wave, like the real first wave, the N was the largest. And then people could decide whether to participate in the following wave, but they could, they could decline, and then in the next wave, like in the third wave, they could come back again. So this is why the N is higher in the second wave in this study.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm just checking the chat here. I don't see any new posts, but is my screen not refreshing? Nope. Well, I've got more questions. I have a question, and perhaps this is not a fair question, but I have a question about the measurement of populist attitudes. And it's not a question just for you, but more generally. One of the items that is used to measure populism, and specifically the anti-elitism, it uses measures that we would associate with political efficacy. So yeah, thank you. That's perfect. So people like me don't have a say about what public officials do. They don't care what people like me think. These are like the traditional measures of political efficacy. And I think that even that last one, there are measures of political efficacy that speak to that, the disconnect between government and citizens. And so I was wondering if you wanted to comment on that. And I do realize that you're building on existing scholarship, so you're solid in that respect, but I just wanted to know your comments on it.
Yeah, I believe the two first items here in our measurement are definitely yeah, you can say that they pertain to political efficacy, but I believe the third one is more like it taps, it measures populism per se. I mean, there is a theoretical link between efficacy and populism or populist attitudes. But I believe that what distinguishes between the two concepts is that the populism stresses the animosity between the people and the elite. And also, yeah, and I must say that in general, that one of the limitations of the study is that this measurement of populist attitudes is biased because we only regard the elite, the political elite in our measurement. And there are certainly other elite groups such as the media, the rich people, the academia, and so forth. So yeah, I agree with you that those concepts. I mean that this measure is a little bit biased when it comes to the anti-elitism component.
All right. I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I guess I will close it off. Thank you very much for the presentation and for staying on time. Very much appreciate that, and thank you. So our next presenter is News Literacy and the Use of Social Media for News in 5 Countries. And I will let Anne is presenting. We'll let you take it away. So 15 minutes, and I will interrupt you at 15 minutes just to tell you to wrap up.
Right, all right. I risk losing time by saying that I appreciate that these measures for populist attitudes are still under scrutiny. That's important to further develop them, and I agree on the criticism that's just been raised there. So this study has nothing to do with populism. It's on news literacy, and more specifically on the use of social media for news and how that relates to news literacy. My name is Anne Schulz, and my co-authors are Richard Fletcher and Rasmus Nielsen. We work in Oxford, and the weather here is brilliant, as you can see, and as is typical for the UK very much. The study that we're going to look at will focus on 5 countries, which poses some challenges that I will sort of explain while on the go. But first of all, I thought we should discuss why we should study news literacy in the first place. And I think some of the presentations that we've looked at and listened to throughout this conference already sort of reveal the point to this sort of thought here is that the concern that people fall for disinformation online increases over time, and that it also becomes more difficult for people to sort of confidently navigate the abundance of information online, be it false or not. And we sort of back this up with our own data here. This is taken from the Digital News Report in 2020 that was published in June, where you see that across the 40 countries that we've studied in that report, 56% on average basically say that they are worried about what is real or fake online, sort of indicating that they're no longer sure to sort of take things apart here. And the idea behind news literacy now is, or the main assumption here is that if we develop our news literacy and particularly our knowledge about the wider news economies in which we live, then the job of navigating that environment becomes much more manageable, and we will be less likely to fall for disinformation, ideally. And this has a certain appeal to me, and you might disagree on that, and that is that I consider news literacy as sort of a self-help measure very much, that sort of empowers citizens to sort of make their own decisions when they encounter information online. And in that sense, this sort of stands in contrast to state regulation or platforms' attempts and desperate attempts of content moderation. So now let's talk about what news literacy actually is, and I've sort of sketched it a little bit already. There are very many concepts out there that are related to it. They can be compared on some dimensions, but not on others. We are following down a line that is sort of labeled under the big label of FILD, under the big label of media literacy. And there is a row of scholars who have been working very hard in defining the concept. I hope that I'll be able to sort of bring this across here with this chart. So news literacy has been defined as a subfield of media literacy that focuses very much on the understanding the news production process and developing critical news consumption skills to identify, appreciate, and engage with news and information. So that there's a lot in that. I'm not even sure if I would call it a definition yet. But this sort of leads to the fact that news literacy, again, is further subsected into more subdimensions, and some of those are listed on the chart. Need for cognition being a media locus of control being another one, and that basically is the degree to which one perceives themselves as being in control of whether and how news media influences, basically a sort of a self-efficacy dimension of the concept. And then most importantly to us, and this is where we will narrow down on, is the component of media knowledge structures, and that's also been termed procedural news knowledge and other studies or related studies. And we have identified certain domains of knowledge here that might be relevant in this aspect of this realm. As for example, who makes the news, how is news selected, and knowledge about how news is financed as well. And then just some comments on that already here. This is obviously problematic from different perspectives to define news literacy as that, but there's also then not very many other options that you have. So it's problematic because you could discuss about the domains that you consider relevant here, and then next step would be to discuss the specific knowledge that would constitute an adequate understanding of these domains. Next problem is that how would you interpret empirical information pertaining to that domain? And then a very tough question as well is, from a normative point of view, what kind of behaviors are we actually desiring here, and what kind of behaviors do we actually want to enforce with news literacy measures, news literacy knowledge? And then yet more complicated if we think about doing this across different countries, as every country is home to a different media system, each probably requiring different sets of explicit knowledge, different skills. And then over time, as we know, media systems change dramatically, technologically and politically. And this, the meaning of what constitutes news literacy from the point of view of today might be outdated already in the next week, maybe, who knows. So that's all problematic, and I thought I should state all that ahead before going into further detail here. But despite these problems, I think the findings provided by previous research make me, myself at least, somewhat confident in increasing the people's news literacy along these dimensions that I've just sort of discussed could result in better outcomes that sort of democracy as a whole can benefit from, as higher literacy was shown to relate to better identification of fabricated news, to a higher motivation to consume news to begin with. It was related to lower conspiracy theory and also higher knowledge about political events. It also in experimental research was sort of moderating hostile media perceptions, lowered them or dampened them. And then in relation to social media, there's very little research going on here so far, which is surprising given the debate that we're having, looking at sort of disinformation being also on social media. There's very little research looking at news literacy and social media. There's one study here from Emily and Tali that showed, also using survey research, that news literacy is related to reporting less exposure to news on social media and less posting of news on social media as well. We want to continue this line of research right here, asking basically the same overarching research question: how does news literacy relate to how people use social media for news? And then our first question is sort of tackling the different ways in which people can make use of social media as a source of news. And these basically differ in how central social media is in someone's news diet. So you don't have to use it as a source of news at all, which could be considered one social media user type. That is really difficult to say. You don't have to use it as all. You can use it as a source of news next to many other sources of news. You can choose it to be your primary source of news or your main source of news. You will still have other sources of news next to it, but social media will be like sort of your main entrance there. And then most extreme and most central would be those who choose social media to be the only source of news. And our assumption here is basically that the more central social media become in someone's news diet, the lower should do expect like the news literacy levels to be. And the way I phrased it sort of turned around the causal approach that we have, but we're using cross-sectional data anyway, so that doesn't play that big of a role. So the second question is, how is news literacy related to the importance of different quality cues that surround a news item on social media? A very different type of question. Just to illustrate what we mean by that, I have a screenshot here of a news post on Facebook in that case, and there are different indicators here that you can go by if you wanted to establish sort of the quality of that news item that's posted there. And quality can have very many dimensions, and I really keep it on that top level here and just say quality. But the person who shared the item can be one. The picture or the headline of the news item can be another one. The news brand as well, of course, and then there's a row or a series of social cues that you can look out for, which are the number of likes, comments, and shares a news item gets on social media. So in order to investigate this, we use the same data that Zimge has just used in her presentation in the previous panel. It's data from the Digital News Report in 2018. We're not using all the 37 countries as she has done here, but only UK, US, Germany, Spain, and Sweden, because these are the countries where we're relatively confident that our news literacy measure has worked. And here it is. You were maybe already curious to see what we did. We went for 4 knowledge questions here. I'm going to read 2 out of you just to give you an example. The first one is, which of the following news outlets does not depend primarily on advertising for financial support? And the correct response, as you might have guessed, is the public service broadcaster, which is the BBC in the UK. But response options were, of course, adjusted to make them country specific. And then just to give you another one, question C, went for how are most of the individual decisions about what news stories to show people on Facebook made? And the correct response here is the algorithm. So you may read on the other questions why I tell you that there is, of course, a lot of room for criticism here, but to defend this measure, I should let you know what our main thoughts are here. That we aimed our questions to tap for a broad range of knowledge, first of all. Many knowledge domains of news literacy should be covered here. And then we focus on factual knowledge as opposed to attitudes. We also wanted these questions to travel well across country contexts. And we also wanted them to vary in difficulty. If you'd like to have more information on the distributions, you are invited to download the PDF that I've uploaded. And there's another table in there that gives you more detail on how different countries fared on this news literacy measure. We used this information here then to compute our critical predictor, the news literacy measure. This is a sum score now computed from the correct responses to these 4 knowledge questions. We code as false. You want to take this as the first thing. We have very few people who had 4 questions correct, and actually 0 on 1 question correct. So if you are working in news business, you might find very frustrating already as a broad public to know how the news is made. Using social media as a source of news was our sort of third dependent variable. And we used 2 questions that you can read through yourself to distinguish different types of social media users, the non-users, the users, the primary users, and the only users. And we contrasted these groups much alike you do that in experiments, just using survey data here. So our first dependent variable, they're all binary. Contrast the non-users, where all of those who use social media for news. The second one distinguishes between those that use social media as a secondary source next to others and those who use it as a primary source. And the third DV contrasts main users and only users. So these are the findings where we see a positive, significant effect for news literacy on using social media as a source of news. So the more news literate you are, the more likely it becomes using social media as a source of news versus not using it at all. So a positive prediction here, but then we run into negative relationships for the other 2 models using The other two binary variables here as dependent variables were news literacy, where using social media as a primary or only source of news becomes less likely the higher your news literacy is. And that these were the fixed effects of a mixed effect model that I run. Here are the random effects to look into country differences. And just really quickly, you see that all slopes are tilting in the same direction for all of the three plots, indicating not much of a country variation here, which was very interesting for us to see. The importance of quality cues, that was our second dependent variable, looking at the second research question that we had here. We had 4 single items here, each of which served as a dependent variable. And we wanted people to tell us, when looking at stories in social media, the person who shared the story, the headline or picture, the news brand, or the number of comments, likes, or shares is very important in helping me decide whether information is likely to be worth my time. And people could disagree or agree to each of those. We see the following result pattern here. The higher someone's news literacy is, the more important will that person claim the news brand to be an important indicator to find out or to establish whether news posted on social media is worth their time. And the same is true for the picture or headline, yet to a lower degree, and the person who shared the news item. And we see the opposite effect for the number of likes, shares, and comments, saying that the higher someone's news literacy is, the less important do the number of likes become. Again, here we have the random effects, and the pattern is just very similar to what we've seen in the first set of analysis. It's very similar across countries, what we find here in terms of effects. And there's positive associations between news literacy and thinking the news brand, the picture, a headline, or the person who shared are important, and a negative relation between news literacy and the number of comments, likes, or shares. So that's been it. We've been running through very quickly now. I hope you were still able to follow. This is a summary here. I think basically the findings provide some indication of the possible effect that increasing the public's knowledge about how the news is made might have. Those with higher news literacy levels are more likely to include social media into their news diets, but they're also sensible to combine it with other sources of news, and only lower news literacy levels are associating with placing social media more centrally into your news diet. And then rather than looking at likes and shares, people with higher news literacy focused on the news brand, the picture, or the headline, or on the person who shared the item, that is, at quality cues, of which I at least consider that these promise more reliability and sort of what they lead you to. And lower levels of news literacy are associated with paying more attention to the number of likes, shares, and comments, as we have seen, so more related to sort of paying attention to what I could term popularity cues here. I thank you very much, and I apologize for the technical problems.
Eric has a question. It's a rather long question, so I will read it to you. And you raised some great definitional points about what constitutes news literacy, issues that should be addressed in more conceptually oriented work about literacy, news knowledge in particular, that goes beyond measurement questions. Not only, whoop, scrolled too fast.
I'm reading with you.
Yeah, okay, not only to define it, but how people are socialized into different media understandings, orientations, and levels of sophistication. There's a rich literature on political socialization, for instance, but little directly on media socialization, other than people's use of digital media and media repertoires. How do people come to be interested in the news to begin with? Who are the key influencers in someone's socialization process? And how does this influence news consumption? Sorry. I guess that's the question.
Am I missing something? I don't know, Eric. I think you've done research on that yourself as well. So I think that's pretty much, that's a very good problem definition, I would say. Thanks for pointing to some of the other sort of literature stacks there, political socialization. I've taken a note of that. I will look into this more closely. If you have more specific sort of texts that I should read or consider, I'd be very happy to receive those. But other than that, I have nothing to add to this comment. Thanks.
Great. The next question is from Christiane. To what extent do you think the relationship between social media use and digital literacy is likely to be recursive? so that the more the people use social media for news, the more that it is likely to provide them with opportunities to increase their media literacy, as well as the other way around. So.
Yeah, well, good question. I think that's the problem of using like sort of cross-sectional data to get at these problems. Of course, so not everything I'd say that happens on social media is bad. I think we all agree on that. And there's also opportunity there for people to learn about how things are working there, and to get sort of also using these environment makes you more familiar with them as well. So that can sort of help you, like you can gather some experiences, and then maybe that will prevent you from doing like mistakes that you've once done in the future as well. So I think, yeah, it can also help people to increase their media literacy, to use social media, definitely. Did this help? Yeah.
Are there any other questions? So I actually don't have a question, I have a comment. I read through the paper. I do cross-national work as well, and I always get asked by reviewers about the choice of countries, and I think that in the paper you do a good job of explaining the choice of countries and the diversity, as well as the geographical diversity, but also the diversity in social media uses and how that adds to your test, the validity of the tests. Any other questions? Okay. Eric asked, what are the future plans for looking at literacy in the digital news report?
I see where that question's coming from, Eric, I think. We're very much in the process right now of developing the new questionnaire. News literacy has come up. We are thinking about repeating some of the questions, but it's always sort of a matter of priorities and space, and I can't guarantee or promise that we're going to do anything with the news literacy questions that we had, or maybe even inserting some that we didn't have in 2018.
Great. There's another question about the patterns relating to age. This is interesting, I think, because social media use is defined by age, and probably more so in specific countries than others, but do you see any differences by age?
Looking into it myself, no, age was unrelated here to, well, actually, what's the question? Sorry, I need to focus on the question more than.
Yeah. Were there, yeah.
Relating news literacy in relation to age. I haven't looked at that really. I think the models that we've had are not really revealing here, because the dependent variable is always something else. But I don't know, I'd assume that the younger you are, like talking about very young groups, the less you know when it comes to sort of traditional news media, and the more you know when it comes to social media. But it's a good question to look into this, as this might actually vary across the different knowledge questions that we have. Yeah.
All right, the last one was a comment, not a question, but there's a long tradition about news literacy in Latin America. Might be outdated, but might be something that you want to look into.
All right, thanks for that suggestion. Right, we have data for Latin America as well, but as I said, it's just so difficult to know if these questions actually are adequate to apply in these countries. So if you've seen these questions now, I think it's Anna who asked that question. It would be really interesting to get a message from you telling me if these could work in Latin American contexts, or if these are completely off from your news realities. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right.
Our next presentation, the title is Embedding, Quoting, or Paraphrasing, Investigating the Effects of Political Leaders' Tweets in Online News Articles, the Case of Donald Trump.
All right, so apologies for the very long title. Let me see if I can share the screen. Share. And maybe I can actually, right. So this is a project that Andy Ross, who's currently at Loughborough University, and I did a couple of, well, we started in 2018. and I'm not sure Randy was able to join us. So, you know, if ever there's a difficult question, then and I don't know how to answer, I'll just blame it on him that he wasn't available. In the meantime, it's been published, which is a relief. So you can read the paper in New Media and Society. So that takes a bit of pressure off this presentation. So I just want to say that so our motivation comes from I guess from a larger project on the influence of, we were wondering what's the influence of including tweets in news articles. And we had the previous paper where we are looking at the impact of social media exemplars in online news articles. And then we thought about what does including political leaders' tweets make, what's the impact of that in terms of citizens' perceptions, both of politicians and of the perceived quality and of the quality of the news article. And obviously, we are also interested in understanding whether Trump's tweets, including Trump's tweets in news articles, has an impact on both what people think of him and also on what people think of the quality of those media articles. So we focused on Trump in this paper, but obviously this should be a longer term project looking at other politicians as well. So I'm going to walk you through the theoretical background, then through the methods and results, and hopefully I'll wrap up before 15 minutes or earlier. So basically we started with this idea that obviously journalists are under severe pressure to produce the news, audience grabbing news. And for those journalists, Twitter is becoming a really important source of quotes, especially for those working at the political desk. On the other hand, you have populist politicians who have developed a way to take advantage of this, to engineer. So they engineer posts that really fit the demands for coverage. So they use negativity, they rely on scandals, so that they can ensure that their posts get picked up, they're more likely to be picked up. On the other hand, there's been research showing that tweets do have an agenda setting potential. So not all the tweets do that, only if they are easy to read, they are plain spoken, they come from actors who do not give interviews otherwise. But basically they do have this potential, and they heighten the salience of attributes that are favorable to the leader who is tweeting or to the politician who is tweeting. And from this point of view, Trump's Twitter style has been studied extensively, and it really fits this criteria. It's very simple, it's emotional, it's provoking, and he's not the only one doing it. There are many other populists who try to emulate, or anyway they use the same style. So it was something that really sparked our interest. On the other hand, there's been some research, but not as much research about what tweets do for Trump. So first you have evidence that because of Twitter, Trump got a lot of news coverage. Some think that it amounted to billions of dollars. So it has obviously put him on the media's agenda. In terms of the effects of these tweets, there is really limited research. Basically, at least in an experimental context, there are a couple of studies that found that Trump's Twitter reaction embedded in an article increased the audience or the public's perceptions of his authenticity, sorry for mispronouncing that word, and experience. And it's actually quite interesting because experience or competence and warmth are key factors affecting politicians' electability. So basically there should be, we were wondering if there's any relationship between being exposed to Trump's tweets in news and people's perceptions of his warmth and competence. So based on limited but pre-existing evidence or research on this topic, we expected that yes, there will be there will be a positive effect. Exposure to verbatim Trump tweets will increase his perceived warmth and competence as well. So then there is the question of the mechanism. And particularly, how does that happen? So now we turn to the literature on emotional appeals in political campaigns, because emotions are really important in political participation and as well as shaping attitudes. So we have on one hand the positive emotions, hope and enthusiasm, that tend to activate predispositions leading to higher support for candidates. And on the other hand, we have negative emotions with anger and fear, usually having different effects, reliance on predispositions or activating, for example, hostility. So our first research question was, is the impact of exposure to Trump's tweets mediated through emotional activation? Then we turn to the journalistic quality perceptions, and there is limited evidence that paraphrasing versus quoting directly affects people's perception of the quality of the news article. But most of this research comes from the pre-Twitter era, and there are various other respects in which there are limitations. So we decided to ask a research question, basically, will the difference in the format of the tweet content presentation result in significant differences between perceptions of the journalistic quality of the article? Okay. So now about the method. What we did was to have a between subject experimental design, which we ran on 2 samples. I'll tell you more about the samples later. So we wanted to find out about Trump, whether Trump's tweets affect perceptions of him and of the article. And so obviously this is quite a tough topic, because everybody has an opinion about Trump. So it was difficult to find a topic on which opinions were mixed, or people were more unsure about what to think about him. And so we decided to go at that time with the Mueller investigation. It was before the final Mueller report, and we ran it in October 2018. At that time, there was talk about basically the conclusions would be coming soon. So we were really stressed that we would that the report would come out in the middle of our experiment. But it turned out that the report came out 5 months later. So we were fine from this respect. We modified an article from Business Insider, which is a very limited known, not a very well-known publication, in which it was about the collaboration, the Michael Cohen's cooperation with the Mueller investigation, and we included 3 tweets from Trump in that article. And in the paraphrase condition, those tweets were paraphrased, basically just stating what Trump meant. The quotation condition, it was just the text, including the capitalization and everything. And in the embedded condition, the tweet was embedded as such. So the procedure, respondents had to read the article for at least 90 seconds. Then they answered questions about emotional responses, Trump evaluations, news quality. Then we asked them we gave them on a manipulation check, and we recorded background variables. These are the questions we used for emotions and Trump evaluations. Basically, the first question they were asked was, to what extent did you experience these emotions? And there were several there. And we took these questions from obviously from previous literature. Then we wanted to know why had people felt that emotion? Who made you feel the most hopeful, proud, anxious, angry, and so on. And then about and the Trump evaluations were, what impression did you personally get of Donald Trump as you were reading the article? And sincere and trustworthy were combined in a warm scale, and knowledgeable, intelligent in a competent scale. For article evaluations, we had this battery, whether the article had been unfair or fair, did not tell the whole story or told us the whole story, inaccurate, accurate, cannot be trusted, can be trusted, opinionated, or factual. And so the samples were US citizens specifically recruited as either Republicans or Democrats on a website that's called Prolific AC. They were recorded at within, kind of at the same time. There was a weekend between those two dates. And after looking at the manipulation check, we ended up with, these are the final samples, 237 Republicans and 175 Democrats. And I guess I can tell you that it was very easy to recruit Democrats and very difficult to recruit Republicans for this study. I don't know, for maybe just because there were fewer to begin with in the sample, in the prolific sample. All right, so now the results. I'm going to start with the impact on emotional responses and Trump evaluations, and then go to the journalistic quality. So first, we would just wanted to see if there's an effect, a direct effect of the manipulation on Trump's ratings, and it turns out that there is an indication, but it's basically limited for worms. And very, very limited. And then there was nothing direct for competence. So basically, there were, no direct effect. And we only looked at the Republicans here, because the Democrats were basically, they rated Trump at 0 anyway. Then we looked at, and you can see that from this graph, from this distribution. Then we looked at the emotional reactions. So you have the Republicans on the left side, Democrats on the right side, and you can see that. Let's see. You can see for the Democrats, basically only 6 people out of the entire sample felt positive about Trump. So it's basically most people just rated that. They did not feel any positive emotions related to him. They did have some, there was some variation for the negative emotions, but no difference between the experimental conditions. For Republicans, there seemed to be from the distribution some difference between the conditions. For positive emotions, but no real difference for negative emotions. So we focus then on positive emotions. So, people feeling positive, hopeful because of Trump while reading the article. We transform the variable so that 0 would be no emotion and 1 would be some positive emotion. And basically, we found that people who had been exposed to the embedded Trump tweets felt more positive because of Trump than those who had been exposed to the paraphrase condition without the whole Twitter thing, without his picture, without the tweet itself. So in the paraphrase condition, it was just the text and rephrased in a nice way without caps and stuff. And so then we wanted to see whether this emotion contributed to how they felt about how they rated Trump. Basically, whether it could be a mediator of the effect of seeing the embedded condition on how people felt about him, on his worms rating. And we find that it does that basically through this emotional reaction, people who had seen the embedded condition were more likely to rate Trump higher by about 1.5 on the 0 to 10 scale in terms of his worms. So remember, this is sincere and trustworthy, and also by about 1.3 on the same scale for his competence, intelligent and knowledgeable. So we do find that being exposed to the embedded tweets that affects people's reactions or people's evaluation of Trump, but only among his supporters or only among Republicans. Among Democrats, there was a flat line. Now going to the impact on article evaluation.
If I can interrupt, your 15 minutes are up. You're welcome to continue talking, but we've reached the 15-minute mark, and if you want to leave room for question and answers, you're eating into that time.
All right, thanks for letting me know quickly on the Okay, I'll just go quickly on this one. So the article evaluation, I just want to present quickly the distributions, which I think they're very interesting, how they were evaluated by Republicans and Democrats. You can see that the Republicans were much more like they used more the entire scale, whereas Democrats liked the article generally. It was actually about how Trump might have colluded with Russia. But then there seems to be more difference in reactions between conditions among Democrats. Among Republicans, we found that those who had been exposed to the quotation conditions, so without the Twitter handle, but with the tweet text, they found the article as less trustworthy. And only that, so we had several variables. We only found that difference for Republicans. For Democrats, we found that they reacted more to several variables. So they perceived the article as more opinionated if containing Trump's tweets, embedded tweets, more partial if they were there in either format, and more unfair and more inaccurate if the tweets were in quoted format. So basically they reacted, they definitely reacted to seeing Trump's tweets in the article, and they kind of tended to associate that with lower journalistic quality. So conclusions, I mean, we list a whole, there are lots of limitations that we list in the article to this study. So obviously it's a relatively small study, but I think the conclusions that we wanted to draw from this is that yes, it does, seeing Trump's tweets in an article does energize the base, and that it doesn't necessarily help journalists look more professional, but it might actually have an adverse effect. So thanks. This is the end of it. And thank you for any questions you might have.
All right, thank you very much. I don't see any questions yet on the chat, but perhaps people are typing. I guess I will ask you then a methods question, which I should have caught, but I'm not sure that I did. But did you use MTurk for the delivery of this experiment, or how did you recruit your subjects?
No, right. So we didn't use MTurk. We used well, they say it's better than MTurk. I'm not sure if that's true. It's a website. It's business in Britain, prolific.ac. So they claim that they screen their respondents better. So they have obviously a UK sample, but they also have a US sample. And so it is similar, but it's maybe, I don't know, maybe they screen them better. I think I can write
there's a question. Sorry, Delia, do you think journalists realize that quoting Trump's tweets compromises perceptions of their work?
Well, so that's interesting because this paper got picked up by a journalist resource, which is it's I guess something that's associated to Harvard University, and they try to advise journalists about various things, and so they picked this up, and so at least it was kind of circulated a bit in the community. I don't know, but I'm hoping that if even one decides to just stop printing those tweets and paraphrase them, that would be a personal victory. So I don't know.
Yeah. All right, Christian has a question. I will let him ask it live.
Yeah, just very briefly, since there were no questions in the chat at that time. Delia and Andy, I was wondering, it was interesting to see that the Democrats didn't move because you were looking at a variable regarding Trump where there was no room for them to move. I wonder if there could be other variables where you might even see a backfire effect among Democrats. So, for example, on issues like policy positions, right? So where maybe Trump says something about infrastructure that the Democrats are not particularly opposed, but But if they see it in a tweet by Trump where he tries to take credit for it, for example, they might actually become more opposed to it. I don't know, given how polarized American politics is, and your findings, of course, contribute to showing that, you know, some tendencies in the press, even further polarization by firing up the base in favor of Trump. I wonder if there is, you know, if you have any intention of looking at backfire effects in the opposite direction among Democrats. Thanks.
Right. So, so I guess I'm not sure if Andy's online, and I see that my camera has stopped working. I'm sorry. So I guess what we were looking here was to find an issue where people were didn't really have set opinions as much as possible related to Trump, which is very, very difficult. I think that for basically every issue, it's very difficult to, I mean, opinions are already formed. So it's, for Democrats and Republicans, it's very difficult to, perhaps I'm not sure if I understand the question, but I think that it's just difficult to change, to observe any variation in an experimental context like this one, where you had, you know, a very a limited, you know, limited experimental stimulus. So yeah, definitely, I think there's something to it, but I'm not quite sure how you'd go about this to study it, just because you're faced with people who already have their very strongly held opinions.
All right. There's another question. Apart from political affiliation, did you consider other traits among your samples, such as academic qualifications, gender, sex, income, background?
Yes, we did control for that. We controlled for basically all demographic variables. We also controlled for whether they had, so all that is in the paper, for whether they were using social media on a regular basis. We also controlled for opinions about Mueller, because we thought that this might be a confound if they thought that, Mueller was in any way, you know, not up to the task, or any, you know, we thought that it was an important aspect. So again, for this, for I guess for current news, and especially with Trump, where it just, I kind of, yes, I think you need to control for a lot of things, because people usually have very set opinions, and so with his article, I mean, he's antagonizing everybody. So, and people might have opinions about the others who's antagonizing, like, I don't know, like Mueller or Cohen or you know, any other aspect of the article that we use. So yes, we did control for that. I'm sorry, my camera is making it's deciding by itself not to work sometimes.
Do we have time for one more question?
Sorry.
Should I go with one more question? All right.
Sure.
Okay. To what extent do you think that the perception of support that embedded tweets reveal, likes and retweets, drive the results you observe? Alternatively, supposed you showed a Trump tweet that was ratioed, lots of replies relative to likes. Do you think the results would look different?
Right. So that's, yeah, I mean, right. That's one of the limitations, right? And we talk about it in the paper in the final discussion. It is possible. I think that's. I mean, obviously, tweets as embedded, they show community support. So I think that this is something that might energize the base. That's one possibility. The other possibility might be that it's the picture as well, like the visual of Trump in you know, like his Twitter handle. It's really, maybe that could explain as well. But I personally think that yes, probably the community response is quite important in this, in you know, kind of decide, I don't know, influencing people. I think so. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for your presentation and for your answers during the question and answer.
Thank you so much.
Move on. Yeah, we will move on to our last presentation. So the effects of gender stereotypes on attitudes and emotions towards refugees. And I will let the presenter take over.
So my paper is about the effects of stereotypes on attitudes and emotions toward the refugees. And I will start with some of the brief theoretical basic to it, and then go deeply into the data. And I hope for any comments or suggestions, because it's still work in progress, and I hope to improve it and also do it in other countries. So the basic for this study start in social psychology and conflict studies that talk about the influence of stereotypes and stereotypical bias in media coverage on the way we handle conflicts, political conflicts like we have, for example, in Israel, that are more permanent, but also conflict like the refugee crisis in Europe, or like now with the COVID-19 in some levels in some countries. And some studies talk about the importance of gender in conflict and in general in intergroup relations, and how gender might shape opinion, behavior, and particularly emotions. But while many social psychology or psychological factors work in most of the world, or in many Western and some of the non-Western countries, gender as it measured as a man and woman doesn't really work systematically in many cases in the Middle East and in Israel. So in prior studies, I found that gender stereotypes actually affect or correlate with emotions and attitudes. And in this study, I tried to find if there has a causal effect between stereotypes, and specifically in this case, gender stereotypes and language, in the relations to outgroups toward the other group, in this case, the refugees in Israel and in Germany. And it's based on many studies, not many empirical, but many studies that was conducted, and so that changing in the language that use change our opinion toward marginalized and outgroups, the marginalized group and outgroups. So just to give some brief understanding to a more extreme version of the use of gender stereotypes in media. So this is a report on a report in a Polish magazine a couple of years ago on representing the refugees in a gender stereotypical term, and you can see the European as the blonde woman and the refugees as the rapists, that clearly illustrating this. But usually it's less clear and more implicit in the way. So in this study, I want to understand the underlying mechanisms of gender stereotypes used in media coverage in shaping emotions and attitudes toward the refugees, the outgroup. The first hypothesis is on direct effect when gender stereotypes, feminine versus masculine, and support for refugees' rights. And the second hypothesis is on mediation effect through manipulation check and emotions, negative and positive emotions separately. And the third hypothesis is about the differences between the countries, between Germany and Israel. That Germany is 1 and Israel is 0 in this case. I used 3 online experiments, 2 in Israel and 1 in Germany, and they include various questions about, I will show briefly the questions I will use in this study. The data that collected, that I collected, include in the pilot study, or in all the studies, masculine and feminine, and then there has a pilot study in Israel, and then 2 main studies in Israel and Germany that conducted more or less at the same period of time, these 2. And then the dependent variables and the mediators include the support for refugee rights, that higher it's higher support, and negative emotions and positive emotions, both of them are higher. and the demographic variables that with some adaptation to the two countries, but that they used on the same scale as possible. So in order to test the first hypothesis, I ran a series of regression model that control for the demographic variables, and you can see that gender stereotypes in all the 5 models predict support for refugee rights, and that feminine gender stereotypes in the article reduce the support for refugee rights. It's in 2 cases when I include the negative emotions together with positive in model 5 and separately, the effect become to be borderline significant. This is also in line with, of previous finding about the effect of the moderating, the strong moderating effect of negative emotions on the effect of gender stereotypes and attitudes. But in general, it seems like in the right direction. And then in the main experiment, I first of all look on the Israeli society. So this is the Jewish Israeli sample, because I can talk about it in the question, why Jewish Israelis. And we can see the gender stereotypes go through the support for refugees through the 2 mediators, but there's no, at this time, direct effect of gender stereotypes on support for refugee rights. And we can see also with we can see in positive emotions that actually the effect is not significant because we have some break here among the Israelis. Among the Germans, the negative effect is also significant, and the positive emotions, in the positive emotions model, it's also significant for the Germans. So while in Israel, negative emotions are mediated this effect, in the German population, also positive emotions affect the support for refugee rights. Now, for the third hypothesis, I run the model for all the questions with the mediator of the country, the moderator of the country between the 3 lines ago from the experiment, of course. And we can see that for negative emotions, there has a clear moderated mediation effect of gender stereotypes on support for refugee rights, and that includes the both samples, of course. But for positive emotions, we don't see. So the non-significant results in the Israeli, together with the German non-very strong effect, make it non-significant also here. So just to summarize, generally in most of the studies, and mainly, especially in quantitative studies, when we speak about gender, we look on differences between men and women. While it's very important, there has other ways that's important to look at when we study gender. For example, gender stereotypes, gender perceptions, and how they influence our emotions, attitudes, and also behavior toward outgroups like refugee, but also other nations, etc. The differences between countries also are very important, that many presenters in this conference already mentioned, and it's very important to take care and look on this kind of differences while we're talking about social psychology or some other mechanisms. The effect of the mediator, the emotions as mediator, is quite important in many conflicts. Also, we saw in attitudes toward the leaders in different countries like Trump and others. So emotions are very strong mediator, and it might be important to take them in account when we look on different issues, especially issues that bring to the floor strong emotions like refugees. And I think we need in general, to go more to the gender stereotypes and look for the use of stereotypes, gender stereotypes as one of the kind of stereotypes, as other kind of stereotypes in media coverage, in media studies, in communication studies, and also in the everyday communication and in other political forms. And we have, especially in the last couple of years, with the rise of the authoritarian or semi-authoritarian leaders in different countries around the world, we see more and more stereotypical bias and gender stereotypical bias. So we need to go more and look into it. And this is my future plans for extending it. And I hope that if someone is interested or want to collaborate on other countries, other places, other direction, I will definitely love to do it. So that's all for me, and I hope I keep the time.
Well, you are great on time. You still have 4 minutes to present. Do you want to present more?
I can create some, yeah.
Well, you're welcome to keep talking. I don't see any questions on the chat just yet, but I do have a question for you. So I'm wondering about your choice of countries. Was there a theoretical reason that you wanted to compare Israel to Germany? And you do find differences in the effects. So I was wondering if you could comment maybe a little bit more on the nuances. Is it something about cultural? Is it elite cues in these particular countries? Is it difference in legacy of immigration policy is causing the differences in the effects that you observed?
So first of all, the choice of these two countries, in Israel and Germany, we have language that is gendered in its nature. Unlike English, for example, you almost cannot speak in Hebrew and German without using gendered phrase. So without having clearly directing to one or other. You can, now there has some kind of attempts to use some kind of mixed language in, especially in academia and let's say higher society places, but it's not something that belongs to the mainstream of the everyday use. So this is the first reason. The other is that Israel and Germany was really different in the way they react to refugees in the general, the majority of the society. So in Israel, the majority response to refugees, it's more like they are from, or let's say refugees from non-Jewish refugees. It's like something that we don't want here. And the government and the public are largely against integrating them in the society. While in Germany, it was again in the mainstream society, it was the other way around. So this was the main reason to choose both of them. And actually, I expect from the beginning that this will be quite different, not like I found, but I expect some kind of differentiation. First of all, historically, the use of gender in national or gender phrase and stereotypes in national campaigns, it was all over the Western world. And it was also core element in the way that the anti-Semitic and the Nazi regime presents the Jewish people. So in the Jewish imaginary or in the Zionist imaginary in Israel, there has some way of trying to create a more masculine society. Some of you may have heard about the rudeness of the Israelis. That is one of the outcomes of this kind of behavior or willingness to be more masculine, more strong. And in Germany, there has some kind of intimidation from this kind of behavior. So people try to be as less as possible, as less masculine as possible, at least in the way that they imagine it. So yes, I think, and I hope I answer all of your questions.
You did great. Thank you very much. So there are a couple of questions in the chat, and I will read them to you. So this is one of the first comments or questions, I guess. This study seems to reaffirm the old myth, men the hunter, women the gatherers, perception of gender construction. Am I correct in assuming this?
Not really. It's more about taking the idea of, we can say, the warmth and competent, as we had in the previous presentation that many scholars use, but also the idea that we construct people in different societies for different stereotypical behavior. It's varies between different groups or between different countries and between men and women. So there has different attributes that we educate people to behave according to them. And based on, I didn't go deeply into it, but based on previous studies that others conducted and I conducted, and gathered the main or several main attributes that used to define masculinity and femininity, I use them in this manipulation in order to phrase gender stereotypes in media coverage and to see how this affects the attitudes and emotions.
Great. So there's another question. What other stereotypes do you think could be studied in a similar way to what you did here that are relevant in contemporary political communication?
I think that it's really, it's not good for the society, but it's maybe good for us as a political communication and politics scholars, that many or several leaders use more and more stereotypes like racial stereotypes, group stereotypes, ethnic stereotypes. So there has more and more use of stereotype, or it's more like, let's say, legitimate to use this kind of stereotypes in public debate, and definitely on social media, but also on mainstream media and speeches. Trump is the best in this, but there has some others that also catch up. And I think we need to look on all of these kind of different variations. So racial stereotypes used in media, group stereotypes, against not specifically national or gender groups. There has also other groups in society. And of course, stereotypes that used to present or usually to delegitimize certain opinions of people or groups. So this is what I get. I hope I answered your question.
That's great. We have another question. It is a longer question, so I will read it to you. There are so many gendered stereotypes in the news, and you might have interactions, wouldn't you? Like if news foregrounds masculine stereotypes among the migrants, but also uses masculine stereotypes to refer to the domestic population, that should differ from mixed presentations. So we the protector, they the helpless, or we the exposed, they the aggressor. What do you expect if both sides are stereotyped in similar ways?
So this is definitely an excellent question, because it's part of my next plan. The basic idea was to see if there has anything, and if it can be replicated, and if it's really solid. But definitely this kind of, let's say 2-on-2, because it's much more complex than 2-on-2, but like we masculine, they masculine, we feminine, they feminine, and other kind of this phrasing, it's definitely affected different way. There has a theoretical work and historical work about the use of this kind of phrasing to racialize group by mainly people from history that look on how it's used to, for example, legitimize genocide of Jewish people, but also other groups, and to, let's say, violate human rights or abuse rights of LGBT people, women, etc. So it's definitely something that important to do in future studies. And also I can add to this that there has different stereotypes in different countries. So not the same stereotypes are always valid in all the countries, and sometimes even not at the same country. So like the Israeli society, it's heavily polarized in many different contexts, and the meaning of masculinity in the, let's say, mainstream secular society, it's totally different than the meaning of masculinity in the ultra-Orthodox community. So, and there's also some other variations that exist also in other countries, and it's important to also pick them up and try to look on them. So I tried the first point to collect as many as possible from news coverage in the last years, and hopefully afterwards to conduct this kind of additional experiment.
All right, so there are more questions. I'm probably going to copy and paste all the chats and send them to you because I don't think we'll get to all of these questions. But let's see, there was one. Have you observed any particular cases of refugees in the media where there were positive effects on public perceptions of refugees?
Again, if I observe any positive effects of media coverage?
On public perceptions of refugees. You can pass on this question. There's a few if you want to see the other questions.
I guess I can't recall something like this now, but I'm sure there has some, and it depends on also the perception of the reader. So if your perception toward a specific framing is different, it's also something that we should keep in mind. So, but I can't recall now something like that.